So I'm Shaykh Dr. Abu Ibrahim, and Alhamdulillah, today I'm very happy to speak about mental health issues, and I'm hoping as a community that we also will embrace the topic and able to speak about this. We should not make this topic a taboo. Suffering in silence is not something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from any one of us. Rather, what Allah wants is for us, when we realize the problem, to go and seek help, and as a community we should be there to help those that need help. What Islam says about mental health is firstly that it recognizes the issue of human beings and their well-being. So if we define mental health in that sort of definition about the person's well-being, then Islam by means addresses the issue and talks about the state of people's mind, state of people's well-being. So it is an issue that is addressed, and in most senses it's addressed in the sense of trial and tribulation. So what it says is that the person's life is not going to necessarily be constant. There will be times where there'll be hardship, and then with that there will be ease. So it's the case of how the person deals with those sort of hardship when it comes. And Islam also says that every person will be tested according to their means, which means again, whenever somebody is faced with a problem, and we're talking about mental health problems here, and obviously we can talk about grief, we can talk about depression, so on. Islam talks about what is the way and tries to provide a solution according to the human nature. So Islam by means definitely addresses those issues. I think regards to being an imam, a lot of people address me and ask me about issues sometimes related to their spirituality. So generally feeling low in eemaan and faith, and sometimes looking at themselves and thinking what can be the causes and so on. So sometimes people can have low self-esteem because they feel as a Muslim they should be upright, and the notion of sins affecting their soul, affecting their well-being and so on. So a lot of the time they will ask me advice how to increase the eemaan. And obviously this is part of well-being, to feel close and to Allah, to feel close to the teachings of Islam, gives people self-esteem and gives them that confidence, especially when you feel there's a sense of belonging in the community. So a lot of the time people will come and speak to me about spiritual issues. Other times they can be quite specific, and as I'm someone that's quite approachable, and just say, I'm suffering from depression, I'm suffering from addiction, I'm quite abusive. So they'll be quite specific to the problems that they mention. In which case, again, as an imam, I'll know my limits and I'll try to advise according to Islamic teaching. But thereafter, if I feel there's a speciality needed, then I'll send them to a specialist regards to dealing with those issues. But I think the main thing as an imam, that I'm approachable, that people are able to discuss these issues. There shouldn't be a taboo when it comes to Islam and topics that deal with people's life, and amongst them mental health. Regards to trends and people approach me, I think it's a positive thing that firstly the individual recognizes there's a problem, there's a mental health issue, something to do with their self-esteem affecting their daily life. I think generally men and women, the fact that they recognize that is very good. Probably when it comes to trend, I think women are more honest and open about the situation they face. And I think once they find an imam that is approachable, they're quite happy to be open about this and express themselves. Whereas the brothers and the men, they're probably hesitant, sometimes not realizing that there is a problem there. And even if somebody is pointing out to them, not seeing that the problem is within themselves. So the trend is, I would say that generally, regards to gender, the women are more open to face the problems that they have and looking for solution. And they're not shy to ask about certain issues. Whereas probably men, they feel that the role that they have in society dictates that they should be strong and not really acknowledge this. And really, we should never see in regards to human nature, that facing a problem is a weakness. I think a weakness will be when we ignore this issue and we don't have the strength to deal with this. So I think generally, the more open we are in society, the better. And I think sometimes even social media can help. Whereas, for example, a sister or a woman to go and speak to an imam in a physical environment may be quite difficult to arrange because of lots of different, factors. But the fact that if somebody is available on social media, and obviously it gives the guarantee of confidentiality, then it shows that there's a trend, that there's a way for them to express themselves regards this issue. They're quite common in society. Marital issues, because a lot of the time people find there is a lot of stress involved in the marital relationship. It could be just simply that there's a misunderstanding between the spouses, in which case, the woman maybe feel she's not been heard, even the man maybe feel that they're not being heard, and this really affects their mental state. We have a saying that the house is called Darus Salam. In Islam, the house is called Darus Salam, the house of peace. And obviously, Islam puts a lot of emphasis, for example, on marital relationship, that it should be a relationship based upon love and mercy, compassion. And sometimes, when we find there's an imbalance to this equilibrium that should be there in a harmonious relationship, then it causes problems within the marriage. And then there are factors that cause mental health issues and so on. So a lot of the time, I presume as an imam, a lot of people are interested in asking me regarding those issues. So you may find, for example, sisters talk about, my husband is abusive, in which case we try to offer some advice regarding that. Some can be spiritual, but other cases we're actually telling them to go and seek proper help in the sense of authorities and so on, or even counseling or mediation. So we're asking them to go to specialists. So this is one of the things. Sometimes even men acknowledge the fact that they can be abusive, in which case, what do I do, Shaykh? And it's quite we have to, whilst they are perpetrators or sometimes the problem, we have to understand Islam has a concept as well that you support the one who's oppressed as well as the one who's the oppressor. So Islam looks at both sides of a problem. The one who's oppressed, we try to help them by giving them support to remove the oppression, whereas the oppressor, we address them as well and we tell them to stop the oppression. And that's why we find great examples in the Qur'an where, for example, Allah sends Musa alayhi salam to Fir'aun, who is the biggest tyrant on the earth at the time. And then Allah says, go and speak to him because he has transgressed, but speak with him with a speech which is light, not harsh manner, because, we want them to realize that they are causing a problem, so on. So, in regards to the sort of trends, people often ask a lot about those issues. But sometimes it's other issues that people will speak about, because we've got to understand we live in a society which is very fast-paced. A lot of demands on the time that we have. So people sometimes have difficulties in trying to prioritize what should be the main aim and goal in their life. So sometimes you're helping them with those sort of issues. And so sometimes people will feel that even the issue of seeking Islamic knowledge, they've not done enough studies and they feel quite low because of that. So we want to empower them to say that, Islam is about balance. So we're teaching about this. Other cases, it can even be to the point of people wanting to self-harm, even having suicidal thoughts. Again, we have to deal with these sort of issues quite sensitively. These are realities for the people. Sometimes just to be flippant about the issue is not going to help. We have to accept that this is a reality for them and deal with it accordingly. I think as an imam and somebody who provides a service to the community, to be well versed in the issue of mental health problems and solution is very vital, because sometimes you're the first respondent to a lot of issues. People who may have, for example, even psychological issues may not necessarily go see the doctor, but they will go and see an imam because they believe it's something spiritual. In which case, you as an imam, you should be able to demarcate the line between what is really spiritual and what is really psychological or requires medical assistance, so on. So I think, firstly, you have to be well versed in the knowledge of Islam, but also have that sort of, quality within you, the ability within you to recognize where extra help is required and so on. Regards to being versed in knowledge, you have to have a holistic understanding of the whole problem, mental health issues. Like I said in the beginning of our interview, that there is trial and tribulation. And trial and tribulation is not something that will happen to someone as a punishment, because quite often people think that if they are tested, that they're being punished. And so sometimes we can give a negative perception. Or you're doing this because, or you're going through this because of something negative that you've done, because of something bad you've done, so on and so on. We've had to realize that what we find is that we have a lot of text that talks about the most tested people start off with being the prophets and those who are righteous and those close to them. So a part of faith is that you will be tested, and what you will be tested with are things that you don't like. So it could be poverty, and it could be hunger, it could be fearing something, it could be a lot of different things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, and this is the way you're tested. So as an imam, you want to be able to appreciate the holistic understanding of how these factors will affect someone from a mental perspective and a mental health perspective. And also you want to be able to relate back to them, not just that there are problems, but there are solutions as well. So, for example, a Muslim is a mirror to another Muslim. So what you do is, that means that whenever you look in the mirror, you're looking to see if you're okay. So what you do to a Muslim is that whenever you see them, and you should see the signs of stress and other factors within them, because you would recognize it in yourself, and then what you need to do, there needs to be intervention. So I think as an Imam, you need to recognize the problem and then to tell people that you need to look out for these signs and help others, because we'll be given the symptoms that come from these problems, and it should be looked at. So as an Imam, we want to do that, and then we want to tell people that no matter how low you feel or how bad you feel the problem is, we're always told by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that after hardship comes ease. So there's always a way out, or there's always going to be a point where you feel the pressure will be lifted. The pressure will be lifted. But obviously we have to find the means in which to remove this pressure, to remove this ailment that we have, and so on. And I think as an Imam, it's very important that we give that sort of general understanding. Because quite often people can go to somebody and the person may just have this perception that whenever we're tested is a punishment, in which case the person comes back no better than having asked the advice. So I think there's another concept there, that whenever you give advice as well, that we're told to give advice, in a way that if somebody was to advise you, that's the way you would want to, because you're more often going to get people who will listen to you and at least consider, because you will try your best with the ability you have to give the correct advice, but you want them to listen and then at least go and contemplate on it and then try to see if that is the right resolution to the problem they have. In regards to the issue of self-harm and feeling suicidal, I mean, this is again something that Islam does not shy away from talking about. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ said, don't harm yourself, don't harm others. Two factors here. Don't harm yourself, don't harm others. So don't harm yourself in many ways. I mean, first we have to look at why are people harming themselves. Whether that can be physically self-harming, whether it can be to the point of being intoxicated. These are all things that Islam recognizes that causes you harm. So we need to look at what is the cause behind this. What are the factors? Sociological factors, psychological factors, could be other factors and so. So we need to look at this. So Islam says firstly, don't harm yourself, which means it is, though the situation exists, what we want to do is avoid that, and don't harm others, because sometimes what we find is destructive behavior of the individual will affect other people. So for example, your anger, la taqtab, don't get angry, for example, the Prophet ﷺ said. So what can happen? People can have issues with anger, and this anger can now affect other people. So what you do, you're harming yourself, because the anger itself is when somebody's angry, they're not in a right state of mind. But then obviously you can go and be destructive towards other people. So what we do, we try to balance those two issues. So the other issues, as I mentioned before the meeting, part of my research was looking into divorce and the issue of divorce according to the perspective of Muslim women. And my research found that a lot of women, when they cannot get the divorce that they need or be released from an abusive relationship, for example, sometimes they lose despair and they think, how can this situation be? And, as well as other mental health problems, for example, having panic attack, anxiety, even having OCD. What a lot of the women mentioned, and this is candidly in these in-depth interviews that we had, is that they contemplated self-harm, in some cases did actually inflict self-harm, contemplated suicide, and did in some cases even attempt. Why? Because of the mental state that they were in, of the pressures that they were facing, and feeling no hope and despair from the situation. So again, we have to recognize that these problems exist. To treat these as taboo, will not help the situation of people who are suffering, but also will not help the situation in the long run. In the long run, which will perpetuate this sort of condition. So as a society, when we hear that people are suffering, then one of the things that we want to do is be able to help and not be judgmental. That's the other problem that we may have. Sometimes people may not approach you with some of these sort of topic because they feel the person they're approaching is going to be judgmental. Be very critical in a negative perspective. Whereas what we have to appreciate is that the person is the one who's suffering, and what we can do is try to relieve them. And one way, the way to relieve them is to give them pragmatic solution that will help them, not to be just judgmental and just say, why did you end up in this situation in the first place? So I think that's quite important for us to understand. What are the causes of self-harm? Why do people feel suicidal? Try to prevent that sort of action happening. But where those people are feeling they've gone to that sort of limit, then to support them to go away from this. And I found one of the things is that to give advice, counseling, this is what my research found, helped a lot of the women go beyond this sort of problem that they faced. I think the reason people don't speak about mental health, there may be a couple of things. Firstly, whenever we look to the text, the way that mental health is mentioned, for example, the word used majnoon. Okay, for example, the hadith talks about that the pen is lifted from three, and amongst them the child until it reaches puberty, the one who is sleeping until they wake up, and then the third one which talks about the issue of the person who is majnoon until they're not majnoon. And majnoon generally, in regards to the Muslim community, means someone who's insane, rather than meaning someone who's got the full capacity mentally at that stage. So, for example, whilst the scholars would differentiate and say that when it comes to mental health issues, some are, for example, we need psychiatric help, whereas others are of a lesser degree, which needs other forms of dealing. The text itself just says majnoon. So a lot of people think that whenever you hear the word majnoon, that, and mental health, then you can't admit to having anything like that. So there's a social stigma attached to that. So that could be one of the other things. The other aspect is that as an ummah, we're constantly told to be close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be high spirited. And so often we repeat this to each and every one of us amongst the community, that sometimes we forget to mention that the other aspect, that when we feel low, we should do things to help us become high. And when I mean high, imanically, in the sense of faith. And sometimes we don't tend to mention that. Sometimes we like to see, for example, Islam through rose-tinted glass, that everything about Islam is good, without to accept that Islam is a way of life, which deals with all aspects of life, which deals with the highs and the lows in life and so on. And I think sometimes, so people don't want to admit that they've got a weakness in their faith. And when I mean faith, because we look at Islam as a whole way of life. So if there's problems in the marriage, marriage is half your religion, half your deen. So people don't want to admit there's problems in their marriage. For example, if there's a problem in practicing, nobody wants to mention that they've got problems in practicing. If they've got bad traits, they for example, got, addictions and so on, nobody wants to admit it because, again, Islam sees it as something negative. If people feel depressed, how can I be depressed when Islam says Muslims should be high? So all of these sort of factors, if you put them together on one scale, can make the issue sound very negative. Whereas if we look at all the other issues that Islam talks about helping people in that sort of situation, have forbearance when you're faced with this sort of thing, then we can see a holistic understanding of this. But unfortunately, sometimes what we do, we keep projecting the positive aspect, so anything negative now becomes a taboo. I mean, how do I deal with my mental well-being? Firstly, to acknowledge that, I will have good days and bad days. No human is perfect, and that's something that we should understand. And because the fact that we are human and social being, I may try myself very much to limit things that could cause me to have low self-esteem, or to feel depressed, or to feel stressed and so on. But the fact is, part of life is that you interact with other people as well. And also that you're not perfect as well. Sometimes your own action can have a negative impact on someone else, and that thus reverse it back to you, so that you yourself feel quite negative. So I think generally yourself, what you do is you acknowledge that you're not perfect, and that you're just like everyone else, and you're striving like everyone else and so on. And alhamdulillah, I'm grateful to Allah for giving me the opportunity to study Islam and to be able to practice my religion. But then again, I also have to accept that there's some days that I will be tested with my faith and so on. So, I mean, one of the things we're told in the morning is just to say, alhamdulillah, praise to Allah. So what we do, that's positivity. The first thing you say is, alhamdulillah, praise to Allah. And really that's just to say grateful for another day, which means I'm now going to be grateful for this day, and whatever comes, I will tackle it and so on. So I think that prepares you from a mental perspective to face whatever will come. So, accepting that you will have good days and bad days is very important and so on. And managing that is very important and so on. And not to see yourself as any different from anyone else in society. And, your problems have to be managed as well. And I think it's very important. I think that's one of the ways that I deal with it. The advice I would give to somebody who's facing mental health issues is to, firstly, not to feel they're alone with regards to the problem that they're having. One thing history tells us is that human nature is that we will face a lot of problems throughout life, throughout the generation, throughout time and so on. That's the way that life is and so on. Feeling low, feeling depressed, all of these sort of things are part and parcel of life, and not to feel alone. So that, firstly, because sometimes that feeling of being isolated can add to the problem. Secondly, to appreciate that help is out there. Now, because you turn to the first person and they're not very helpful, doesn't necessarily mean that there is no help there at all. And that's where, as a community, we can help that person. So we know, whilst they try to help themselves, we help them as well. And I think that's important. And I think that takes a lot of courage and a lot of, contemplation regards to the self to go and seek that help. And I think it's important. So for them to have the courage to go and seek the help, and for us as a community to have avenues where they can come and approach us. And I honestly believe that we have to be non-judgmental, because, like I say, not any one of us are perfect. So to have that sort of high ground is not the way to deal with these sort of issues. No, we're not the way to deal with this. So to not feel isolated, to feel that to know that there's help out there, and then to have the courage to go and seek that help. And then we leave the rest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it easy for them thereafter. So in regards to how important is it to speak about mental health issues, I think it's very important. And we should use the different platforms that we have. For example, today we're doing a video, so social media platform, but also as an Imam, I use the mimbar when I get an opportunity to pass on message about mental health issues and so on. We should be blogging, we should be writing, we should be using whatever means is available, especially as we have the technology nowadays to spread the message, to firstly make people aware that mental health issues exist. Islam does talk about it. Islam does give some solution about this. Islam also balances the issue of spiritual needs to regards to actual physical needs. We should look at medical issues, psychological issues, and so on. So I think whatever platform we have, we should use it, and we should be quite candid when we speak about this. I think quite important not to look at it as an abstract thing, that they bring in lived experience of people and so on, which I mentioned about my research, is where I went and looked at, for example, the topic of divorce from a lived experience perspective. Because quite often, even when we deal with this, sometimes we just deal with it from a theoretical perspective and an abstract perspective, whereas it's so important that we have lived experience with us. So I think we need to have a combination of using all the platforms and to talk about the topic in a manner which is not just theoretical but practical, and bring the experience of people as well. Another example we have, for example, is when a woman, she was suffering from epilepsy, and she came to the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam to complain that she's suffering from epilepsy. And what would happen is when she would have a fit, she would be in a state that she wouldn't know where she was, and sometimes she would become uncovered. So she would expose her aura, those parts that people should not see and so on. So she came and she complained to the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam about her situation, but then she asked the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam to make dua, which is a supplication for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to cure her of this condition. So the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, as we know, the dua of the prophets, the supplication of the Prophet are accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But before he was about to make this dua, he asked the lady, he said, look, there's one of two options that you have here. I can make this dua and I can stop this. But if you want, I can also ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give you patience regards this issue. So to persevere, and then what will happen? Allah will give you paradise in return. Because epilepsy is something that happens to most, it's common in the community. So to exceptionalize it to the point that to remove the problem which actually exists in society, the Prophet says, look, you can be an example that if you show forbearance because it's something that Allah is testing you with, then I can make another supplication that Allah gives you reward for this and you get paradise. So the lady, she said, I'll accept the latter. And what actually happened is thereafter, whenever the woman had epileptic fits, he said that she would have the normal fits that she had, but what would happen on every occasion, she would not be uncovered, which was her main concern. Not the fact that she had epilepsy, but the fact that she would become uncovered. And we find from that example, the Prophet ﷺ helped her in understanding the situation. Looking at the Qur'an, we have examples about mental health issues, and looking at the Sunnah, we find examples of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ mental health issues as well. And remember, mental health is a very broad term when we talk about depression, even grief. Islam even talks about how you deal with grief when there's a loss of somebody or so on. For example, we find in the Quran, for example, Yaqub alayhi salam, when he hears of the news that he's lost his son Yusuf alayhi salam, he grieves. He grieves to the point, it says in the Quran, that he grieves so much that he cries so much. And then the text talks about, for example, him going blind from the crying. So, this really is like sorrow for a person. And in this case, it's like just to hear that he lost his son. Though it wasn't confirmed that Yusuf alayhi salam was dead or so on, but the fact that there's a loss there. So you can see that there is a mental health issue. Similarly, we find in the example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when his son Ibrahim was on his last breath, and it said that his son was only 2 years old at the time. He carried his son in his hand and he saw the last breath go. And then the Sahaba, they noticed the Prophet ﷺ was weeping. There was a tear coming from his eye. And they were kind of shocked to see the Prophet ﷺ in that state. Because obviously we know the eemaan, the faith of the Prophet is the highest. And they said, "Oh, Ya Rasulullah, you are crying. You are crying." And, there was an exclamation mark as to why are you crying? Because we know in Islam, our text tells us, for example, children who die before puberty, they're in paradise. So there is, for them, in regards to the hereafter, there is no concern. But the Prophet ﷺ said that he has to address this issue. So he turns to them and he says, yes, the eyes are crying. The heart is grieving. But we do not say anything except that which will please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that, oh Ibrahim, we miss you so much. So he acknowledges the human aspect of this. And that's something that we need to address as well. And the Prophet ﷺ was not shy to talk about this. Though in the society, where, for example, you may think in Arab society men have to be tough and so on, the Prophet ﷺ said, no, this is human nature. And we are saying when we feel lost, or we feel low, or feel depressed, we're only saying those things that are actually happening to us. And even Allah acknowledges that within our human nature.